Good afternoon, everyone, or morning, or wherever you may be. I'd like to welcome you to Gowling WLG's live webinar on examining risks and opportunities in Canada's procurement models. My name is Paul Harricks. I'm a partner of the firm here in our Toronto office, and I'm the head of our energy practice. We have an interesting hour ahead of us, looking at some of the aspects of the procurement models here in Canada. And to get started, I'd like to introduce you to the people around the table with me here in Toronto who will be addressing the topics of the day. We have Michael Killeavy, who is well known in the energy sector here in Ontario. He was Director of Contract Management at the Independent Electricity System Operator and its predecessor, the Ontario Power Authority, from 2009 until 2018. And for the past year, he's been an executive advisor here in Toronto at Power Advisory LLC, where he's responsible for providing advice on commercial, contractual, and market-related matters to clients in the province's electricity sector. We also have Goulding, who is the president of London Economics International, also based here in Toronto. began his career providing natural gas market analysis, and subsequently he lived in India for a couple of years advising the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. His experience has taken him all over the world, every continent, as he puts it in his CV, except Antarctic. At London Economics, he's taken on responsibilities that include project management, marketing, and budget and financial control. He also serves as an adjunct associate professor at Columbia University, from which he has an MA, where he teaches a course on electricity market design and regulatory economics. And finally, my partner, Tom Timmins, who leads our new energy team here in Toronto and across Canada. Tom has been involved in new and renewable energy since the inception of the Ontario electricity market 20 years ago. He's also chair of the Canadian Solar Industries Association and has led a number of our firm's largest transactions in the power sector. So just to set the scene, today's webinar is entitled Examining Risks and Opportunities in Canada's Procurement Models. It's a very broad topic, and we only have an hour. So we've decided to narrow our scope a little bit to permit a more in-depth discussion. Our principal focus will be on the ongoing consultation in Ontario around capacity markets and alternatives to capacity markets. For those of you who are familiar with Ontario, you recognize that Ontario makes a challenging place in which to move ahead with the procurement of electricity. Observers of the market will recognize that although the province currently enjoys a surplus of electricity capacity, that situation is going to change over the next few years. One of the principal drivers of that change will be the upcoming shutdown and decommissioning of Ontario Power Generation's Pickering nuclear plant, which provides at any given day about 15% of the electricity in the province, and that's scheduled to begin in 2023. In addition, we have, of course, a projected increase in electrification of transportation, which will have an impact. And we're also confronting the fact that over the coming years, many of the fully contracted assets in Ontario will come off contract. The Ontario market has, for many years, been what has been dubbed a hybrid market, in which a large amount of the generation is government-owned and rate-regulated. And there have been very few opportunities for the development of a true bilateral contract market. We also have a situation in which the provincial government has played a very significant role in market design, governance, and procurement. Over the past 2 years, the Independent Electricity System Operator has been working with stakeholders to develop a comprehensive incremental capacity auction, which is a fundamental component of its market renewal project. In the ISO's view, the ICA will provide in the long term the most reliable and efficient solution to meet Ontario's future capacity needs by targeting a late 2022 auction to address Ontario's coming capacity needs. So with that background, I'm going to turn it over to Tom Timmins to help moderate our discussion. Tom?
Thank you, Paul, and welcome everyone. Without much further ado, we're certainly in a time of change in the Ontario energy market. Goulding has put a lot of thought into capacity markets in particular, and so I'm going to turn the floor over to AJ. And AJ, I know you have a few slides to show us, so I'll let you take it from here.
Great, thanks so much. In terms of capacity mechanisms, we've been deeply involved in the development of the mechanism in Alberta, as well as in terms of critiquing the evolution of thinking here in Ontario. And we've also done a fair amount of economic modeling of the proposals both here and in Alberta. And there's a few things that it's important to understand about capacity markets and mechanisms in general, and also specific to Ontario. So stepping back a minute, what is a capacity mechanism, and why are we considering it here in Ontario? So if we think about electricity market designs, we can have a range of alternatives. We could have an energy-only market, but that requires us to have a high degree of tolerance for price volatility and the ability of prices to go up to value of lost load in certain hours. Or we can try and constrain these energy market outcomes in ways that are more acceptable to policymakers. But when we do that, we run the risk of there being insufficient money for market participants. And the role of capacity mechanisms is often viewed as replacing that missing money. I sometimes think of a capacity mechanism as being a payment for existence, or what you might think of as an insurance premium, in that it's particularly targeted at low load factor plants that are required for reliability purposes. Now, why are we talking about this here in Ontario? Well, Ontario has cycled through a number of procurement models. We started with a wholesale market design, got cold feet with regards to that market design, moved to a central procurement mechanism. We later simultaneously had a feed-in tariff mechanism that was in place for several years. As we moved away from fidelity to the long-term plan, we started to see some oversupply, started to have an understanding that our procurement mechanisms were producing uneconomic results. And there was a desire to think about, is there another way to do this? And given the prevalence of capacity mechanisms in neighboring jurisdictions, one school of thought has been that the capacity mechanisms will help to avoid stranded costs in the future, help to manage the risk of over-procurement, and will ultimately provide for a diversity of resources and technologies that might not otherwise arise in a large-scale competitive procurement model. What are a few things that are important to understand about capacity mechanisms? Well, first, they are regulatory constructs. They are not traditional markets in the sense that we're looking at the market determining the optimum level of supply and demand, that we're having unconstrained pricing. In fact, these are tightly controlled regulatory mechanisms which set both maximum and minimum prices in some cases, which set the amounts procured based on policy initiatives. Capacity mechanisms are not a free revenue stream to generators, and they are increasingly coming with performance standards that provide penalties if the plant is not available during the period of greatest need. So Ontario has released a high-level design There's nothing set in stone about that high-level design, but there are a few aspects of it which are interesting. The first is that, unlike in other jurisdictions, the mechanism focuses primarily on incremental capacity. So it is an incremental capacity auction, and only that incremental amount that's required to serve future projected load is being procured.
AJ, can you just break that down a little bit for
Sure.
our listeners? What do they mean by incremental capacity? And just before you do, if folks are interested in asking questions, you can click on the top left of your screen. There's a dialog box there to post any questions. But AJ, what are they? We always hear this term. What do they mean by incremental? What are we referring to?
So over 90% of current supply is under either a contractual or a regulatory model which provides for a high degree of predictability with regards to top-line revenues subject to production. And what this means is that the market designers have taken a view that these folks are already covered. They don't need anything, and their plants are going to continue through the end of their contract or through the end of their regulatory arrangement. Therefore, the plants that are likely to have missing money are those that are needed for future supply. And so therefore, the idea is that for new plants or for upgrades to plants that are off contract or just to continue operating, they will achieve their target revenue through a mix of energy and capacity revenues. Because of the hybrid market that Paul talked about, the hourly Ontario electricity price is certainly insufficient to prompt new investment on its own. And so the capacity mechanism is an intent to, when we look at all sources of revenue, provide a signal for new participants. But existing participants that are under contract or under regulatory arrangements will not be eligible for capacity payments and will not participate. Now, over time, the incremental, in theory, should get larger as contracts roll off. And if the government is sufficiently disciplined to force all participants, including those that it controls, to finance new capacity off of the capacity mechanism. And I'll return to that point in a minute. Another aspect that's unique about what Ontario is currently proposing, the high-level design, is the seasonal aspect in terms of separating the mechanism into summer and winter and having separate demand curves that will produce different results. This is interesting, but maybe more complex to implement. Another thing that is worth following carefully as the design evolves is the potential for a multi-year commitment. We see large differences across North America and around the world with regards to the potential for a multi-year commitment. My personal view is that getting this right is essential in terms of providing the appropriate signals for new investment. In North America, we see New England with the potential for an up to 7-year lock-in, PJM for 3 years. Other mechanisms have no multi-year provisions. The Alberta design does not. UK goes much longer. So this is a key feature to be watching as the mechanism design evolves. Now,
sorry, just to interrupt you there, AJ. Help me understand that. So we have, let's say we have a NUG plant that's come off contract.
Yeah.
And where do our interests lie there, like just from a private sector perspective? Are we looking for a multi-year contract so that we have certainty, or are we looking for a shorter term? How do you think that plays out?
Well, you raise an interesting question, and one of the things that the ISO has alluded to in their design documents is the possibility, which would be quite unique, of allowing folks to specify how long they want, and then figuring out how to clear an auction that has different preferences for length. It's very interesting theoretically. Whether you could make it work is another question. But the trade-off from the standpoint of a policymaker is that you want to avoid locking yourself in for longer terms if you can help it because of the potential for changes in costs. But at the same time, you're talking about large-scale investments, potentially, that need to be financed. Now, if I'm a NUG contract that's coming off contract, I have a few advantages. Right? I've got a site. I have some remaining useful life. I may want to take a strategy of run it until it breaks, until I can't possibly fix it again. And so I may be happy with a little bit less length on my contract, especially if that gives me an advantage over others. In fact, as a NUG that's coming off, I might actually like the one-year commitment design because it's going to be a bit of a barrier for new entry. That said, when we look at PJM, for example, which only offers a very limited set of circumstances for a 3-year lock-in, they've seen significant investment. And so it is, your view on this question is going to very much depend on the assets that you have and the capabilities that you see. So I do want to note that this is a province in which we have seen, I'm trying to think of polite ways to put this, policymakers be rather hands-on with regards to the evolution of the sector. And for these mechanisms to work, you have to have everybody rowing in the same boat in the same direction. The challenges that we're facing in the U.S. are really because not everybody is facing the same incentives, and a significant number of resources are receiving out-of-market payments. And the question for us in Ontario is going to be, as the market tightens, is the government going to have sufficient confidence in the market mechanism not to issue directives to OPG to build or to otherwise enter into arrangements that occur outside of the mechanism, because that's going to have an impact on investment signals. So I'm not going to go through the deck. I think I have, 3 more minutes or so?
The deck is amazing, folks.
So I'm just going to highlight, if we go to slide 5, because I think that these questions are the ones that anybody should be thinking about as you look at a capacity mechanism. We need to know how much to procure, who buys it, how it's allocated, for what period of the price is known, how far in advance, how are accounts settled, how are other electricity product markets affected. And I think that this is a very important point in that each individual generator needs to reach their target through a set of product markets, right? Those are energy, ancillary services, capacity, possibly environmental attributes. Each generator is going to be different. the market doesn't exist to guarantee every single generator a profit. Right? So the market design is not necessarily a failure if 1 or 2 or 3 generators don't make money as a result. It is a failure if it doesn't provide the investment that's required at the time that it's needed to maintain the specified degree of reliability. And the challenge that is really facing markets today is what happens as we move to a higher share of intermittent resources in the market. And we have some slides here that discuss this, but I'm not going to present them in any great detail. Instead, what I think we all need to be aware of is that capacity mechanism designs have evolved substantially over the past 15 years. We went through a number of phases where we started to do things like increasing the participation of demand response, thinking about, well, we're buying this capacity, but what do we actually want folks to be obligated to do? Each of these iterations resulted in new rules. But if we're moving towards a world where we have significant zero marginal cost resources, significant batteries, then we have to question what the role of the energy market is going to be, and in turn, where that leaves the capacity mechanism, right? Because it's possible that a larger and larger proportion of resources will be relying on capacity mechanisms for a greater and greater proportion of their required revenues. Are the market and mechanism designs that we're considering today consistent with what we need for the future or not? And I think that's probably a good segue into your presentation.
Well, maybe just before we leave you, AJ, thinking about Ontario's incredible hydro assets, many of which are coming off contract, is this a possible kind of route forward to them? Like many of them contracts aren't ending for 5, 10, 15 years, or are those assets just too big to kind of benefit from something like this? They're basically batteries at the end of the day.
Yes. This has been a topic of interest recently, and I think that there's a theoretical and practical response, right? The theoretical response is, yes, this can work in order to continue to keep those resources available. These resources, they have revenues from ancillary services. They've got revenues from the energy markets. The amount that they need in the incremental capacity auction is certainly smaller than what a new build would require. Now, if I'm sitting on the other side of the fence, right, if I'm the owner of this portfolio of assets, right, when they come off contract, I'm going to say to the government, these are unique assets. The capacity mechanism doesn't really reflect the unique value that I provide to the system, and I am deserving of a longer-term contract. Now, government could say, look, you know what, we've designed this capacity mechanism to give you that option. Go forth, and if you win, great. If you don't, we don't care, right? There has been no evidence to date of governments being willing to do that for strategic assets. Right?
Okay. And I've got a ton more questions. I know some of our listeners do as well. But before we come back to you, AJ, I'm going to let Michael take the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Killeavy with Power Advisory. And Michael's got some really great perspective on this as well. So, Michael, take it away.
Thanks, Tom. I mean, AJ, you're a tough act to follow, but I'll do my best. So I don't want you to think that I'm anti-capacity market. I'm just trying to point out that there are some issues. I think that short-term and voluntary capacity markets, capacity auctions, whatever, however you want to term it, They can help meet some power system needs, but I think the capacity markets have some challenges, and that is in terms of bringing on new generation. And that's particularly, I think, acute here in Ontario. And there's a couple of different reasons I'm saying that. First one, I mean, AJ, you were really nice talking about policymakers being hands-on. I'll be a little more blunt and just call it regulatory and political risk. There's a lot of that in Ontario. You also, a unique feature of Ontario is you have a large proportion of generation in Ontario is both government-owned and also rate-regulated, which you don't have in a lot of other jurisdictions. There's a lack of bilateral contracting opportunities in Ontario. You basically have the ISO, the only game in town. Governance in the electricity sector has been an issue for a while. I think it's being brought to the fore more now that the ISO started with the market renewal project. But I think that this actually accentuates a lot of the merchant risk that generators face. And then I think also there will be some challenges in financing projects in a capacity market. And I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in some of the other slides. I'll go to slide 4. So in terms of regulatory and political risk, I mean, there was a change in government June of last year, almost a year ago. And one of the first things they did was cancel 758 FIT contracts and LRP contracts that hadn't achieved a certain milestones in terms of the development of the facilities. And then I think most strikingly, and you haven't heard a lot about this, but I think that's just something that actually is actually a little bit more chilling. They actually passed legislation to terminate a contract that they didn't have a right to terminate, and that's the White Pines project in Eastern Ontario. That was pretty dramatic. Having been at the Ontario Power Authority when the Liberals were, the last government was in power, the Liberal government, I mean, I was involved in the relocation of the 2 gas plants because of the hands-on nature of some of the policy makers, which cost ratepayers, you know, if you listen to the Auditor General, around $1 billion. So political involvement in the sector creates a great deal of policy instability and uncertainty for investors, and this creates a risk for investors that they really can't control or mitigate in any way. Lenders may be unwilling to lend to projects or will only do so at an increased risk premium, which will raise the cost of projects for everybody, and it may actually defeat the purpose of having a capacity market in the first place. The second big aspect that I see that creates an issue for capacity markets in Ontario is the fact that, Ontario's largest generator is OPG. That accounts for about 17,000 megawatts of capacity, which is about 46% of the capacity in the province. And it's all predominantly rate regulated. There's also an issue, I pointed out when I was there, is you have the OPG board and the ISO board are both appointed by the Minister of Energy. So I think you could make an argument they're actually affiliates. They're affiliated in some fashion. So you have a unique situation where you've got the largest generator in the province being affiliated with the entity that's actually running the capacity auction. I think investors might look on this negatively when it comes to making a decision as to whether or not to invest in new generation in Ontario.
Truly, and merchant, this is almost merchant
generation.
It would
be merchant, yeah.
This is like
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And yet half of your capacity is owned by the government, and who else will appoint a board of directors for the guys running the capacity auction. There's also a lack of contracting opportunities. Unlike the United States, where you've got load-serving entities, in Ontario, you've really only got the ISO. They are really the main contracting counterparty. It's a monopsony. So you don't really have a lot of buy-side opportunities here in Ontario. And those opportunities, they give generators basically a way of hedging the risk that's associated with capacity markets. So you really don't have that here. Governance, in terms of the market rules that will need to be implemented in order to create a capacity market in Ontario, they will be passed by the ISO, and the ISO board of directors has kind of the sole authority over passing market rules. In the U.S., the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has regulatory oversight over ISOs in U.S. jurisdictions, and especially for like capacity markets, design changes, rule amendments, they're all ultimately subject to the FERC reviewing them, and they have really transparent and inclusive regulatory proceedings. The government of Alberta has adopted a similar type of process for the capacity market, the rule changes that are being implemented there right now. In fact, I have a colleague that's sitting in some of the hearings taking notes.
Michael, it's Paul. Do you have a view on whether the ongoing governance review at the OEB is going to have a beneficial effect on what you've just been talking about in terms of the
I think it could if it spreads to, if they give the OEB some kind of regulatory oversight in terms of the market rules. Right now, you can charge market rules on some fairly narrow grounds, right? It can't be discriminatory against a market participant, and it can't be contrary to the principles of the Electricity Act. And I think in legislation, the OEB's got 60 days, I think, to make a decision if somebody were to challenge a market rule. I think if they were to broaden the criterion that they could review the market rules and also relax that 60-day time period, that would be very, very helpful. And I think that would be seen positively by a lot of participants. So if you go to the next slide, just a short overview of sort of how decision making is done with the ISO compared to, say, 3 U.S. ISOs that have capacity markets. They have much broader participation. You can see it's in the hundreds, whereas in the ISO you've got a technical panel of 13. Whereas everybody does get a vote to some extent, the vote really, I would argue, with the ISO isn't meaningful because at the end of the day, the technical panel is basically providing advice to the board of directors. It's the board of directors, so they're the ones actually calling all the shots. And then the 3 U.S. ISOs that I have are ISO New England, ISO New York, and PJM. They are subject to, again, to that FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission oversight in terms of reviewing the market rules. You do not really have that in Ontario. You do have an ability to challenge market rules, but again, the time period is quite compressed, and there's only 2 main criteria that can be used to do that. Go to the next slide. The last thing that I want to talk about here in terms of the issues and the challenges that I think generators will face with investing in the capacity markets in Ontario. In order to make a project bankable, you need stable and predictable cash flows. If you just want to go to the next slide briefly, I graphed some of the clearing prices from capacity markets in U.S. ISOs and in the UK. And you can see that they're sort of up and down like a roller coaster. That I think could be a potential problem for anybody wanting to invest in a project in Ontario. There's also an issue with subsidized resources. It's primarily an issue in the United States. We've seen a lot of it recently with PJM, with subsidized resources suppressing capacity prices. It's been an issue with PJM. They have a minimum offer price rule, a MOPR, which they had applied to new resources. They tried last year to apply it to existing resources of all different fuel types. There was a lot of uproar about that. And my understanding is the FERC looked at it, didn't actually come to a decision. So I believe it was last month, PJM decided they were just going to conduct the auction this coming August using the existing rules. Another issue with capacity markets is there can be some rather large penalties for non-performance, which negatively impacts stability of any of these cash flows. I mean, lenders are going to probably want to have reserves set aside to cover off any potential penalties that might crop up. Capacity markets typically have a short commitment period on the order of a year, and that may not be enough time to actually earn enough revenue back to pay back your debt and to provide anything for equity investors. There's also a risk. I was dealing with a client late last year who was thinking about some battery installation for the upcoming ICA, and we had to point out to them that you kind of have to clear each year in order to be getting a capacity payment, or even if your capacity is included in the market as being there, you'll end up being a price taker. And so there's a lot of instability in terms of what that revenue is going to be like, and is it going to be sufficient to actually pay back your debt and provide something at the end of the day for equity investors. That's a potential issue that I see. Go to the next slide. I think we can probably, again, this is I talked about the suppression of prices, the minimum offer price rule. There's also, the cap, I think, in most of the jurisdictions in terms of the maximum price that they're willing to pay for capacity. Anyway, go to the next slide. So in terms of procurement alternatives, it's on slide 13. The majority of Canadian and U.S. jurisdictions ensure resource adequacy through contracts and regulated rates. ERCOT, California ISO, and MISO, I don't believe have capacity markets.
I mean, we tend to say that Cal ISO and the Mid-Continent ISO have different mechanisms that serve the function, but they are quite different. I mean, we do model a capacity-like product for Mid-Continent ISO, but because both of them have much more, Mid-Continent, most of the members are under regulated rates. It produces very different outcomes, and Cal ISO is a completely different mechanism. So
yeah. So contracts are typically used in all jurisdictions. I think the unique challenge that we have in Ontario is that really the ISO is the only buyer. There's not a lot of active buyers in Ontario. In many ways, wholesale electricity markets are coming full circle. They were originally designed to dispatch on price, mainly fossil fuel generation. The missing money problem partially justified capacity markets. The supply mix is changing. You're seeing more renewables, you're seeing more distributed energy resources. So capacity markets, I think, as we've seen, are fundamentally being challenged. And for this reason, we think that Ontario should be taking a pragmatic approach to ensuring resource adequacy. The next slide.
Michael, do you think, you talked a couple times about load-serving entities and that as a model which we have not adopted in Ontario, but we certainly talked about it from time to time. People talked about LDCs as load-serving entities, for example. I mean, is there any traction? Do you think there's any momentum at all around moving to a load-serving entity model in Ontario?
There has been some talk about it, but I think most of the focus now is on the market renewal project. And so I think it's probably attracted a lot of the attention away from that. But I think in future, I think there's probably going to be a push to make the LDCs load-serving entities. There's a whole lot of issues around that, but I think it's eventually something that's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is the governance issue or the ownership issue around LDCs, because they're municipally owned. That's right. That sense challenges. But
so in terms of the procurement, some potential objectives for existing resources. I mean, I've got a whole long list of these. I don't want to take up too much time. Fairness, we want the ability to compete with other resources. Utilization, you want to maximize the utilization of the resources. Revenue certainty, for sure. I mean, if you're an investor or an equity, if you're a lender or an equity investor, you want some revenue certainty. Flexibility, recognizing different resources by different fuel types, technologies, vintages, commitments in terms of revenue certainty should appropriately be commensurate. And also reliability. Go to slide 15. I continue. In terms of objectives for new entry resources, again, fairness, revenue certainty, timeliness. We want to make sure they have enough time to actually develop their project. That can be an issue. There's I think a 3.5-year forward period right now. If you're building a new gas plant, I don't know if 3.5 years would actually do it. If you're building a hydroelectric facility, 3.5 years wouldn't get close. You probably need twice that. Risk allocation options that enable project development should be appropriately allocated between the developer, the customers, and the other entities like the ISO. Bankability is a big thing for new entry resources. I've already talked about that. And again, reliability. I've done a little. I've looked at four main options for consideration. The energy-only markets, which is the situation we have in Ontario, Alberta, so the Southwest Power Pool, and I think ERCOT, energy-only markets. Capacity markets, PJM, New York ISO, ISO New England, and Ontario and Alberta are considering this. We have contracts and rate regulation. And on the next slide, I did a bit of a matrix here. It's maybe hard to read, but I went through the various criteria. And in terms of energy-only markets, I mean, they are efficient. They do ensure competition. They are transparent. I think where they fall down is when it comes to certainty of revenues, because that is a big problem in energy-only markets. In terms of capacity markets, I mean, they're probably the second best in terms of efficiency. They do promote competition. There is certainty because you do have a commitment period. You do have a fixed amount of money being paid for your price for existing, as AJ points out, and they are transparent. I think contracts, they can tick all the boxes in terms of efficiency, competition, implementability, certainty, and transparency. People may question about competition, but I would go back to the days of the Ontario Power Authority ran competitive RFPs for contracts. I think they work fairly well.
Some of which are going to be coming off of term.
That's right.
In the next 5 years.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. And in terms of rate regulation, I mean, rate regulation can deliver all of these things. I guess the problem with rate regulation is that there is no competition. Go to the next slide. In terms of the fairness, utilization, revenue certainty, flexibility, reliability, time minutes, risk allocation, and bankability, I mean, I think that when it comes to the energy markets, there really is no resource adequacy requirement in energy-only markets. There's a timeliness issue as well in terms of uncertainty about the availability of the resources because they're not locked in. There's just hour to hour or 5 minutes to 5 minutes as they're dispatched. Capacity markets, again, they can tick all the boxes. Contracts can tick all the boxes. In terms of fairness, I think rate regulation, there are issues there because there is no competition. And in terms of utilization, utility incentives towards its own assets. So there's an incentive there to basically, because it's rate of return regulation, to build more stuff. So that's a bit of an issue. End of the day, I think that, if you go to the last slide, I think that contracts tick all the boxes, and I think the capacity markets are right behind.
Very interesting.
So that's my outlook, my perspective on things.
Thank you, Michael. A couple of questions. Who are the stakeholders here in Ontario? Who's calling their minister or calling the ISO? Who's out there that you're seeing who's saying, okay, we're interested in this, but we want to make sure we tweak it? And maybe you've seen, AJ, you've seen others in other jurisdictions. Who are the players here, just generally?
I haven't really heard that a lot of people are contacting the government. There's a lot of reluctance to contact the government because the government seems to be, I don't know if it's true or not, but they seem to be very much anti-energy right now. They passed a lot of legislation that really that kind of discourages people from developing projects. I think people are pretty much sitting back waiting to see what comes out of the detailed design for the ICA, which would be, I think, next year.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken.
I would argue that they're probably sitting back a little bit too much.
Yeah.
Who should be contacting calling the ISO?
Well, I think if you've got a good project at a potentially good capacity price, you'd certainly want to make sure that you've got your foot in the door, for sure.
I sort of get the sense, and I'll betray my, I don't want to say prejudice, but my other hat that I sometimes wear is I sit on the board of directors of the Association of Power Producers. And, you know, we sat around, without telling tales out of school, sat around the directors table there and talked a lot about capacity markets and capacity auctions and where the APRO members fit into it. And I think it's fair to say there's a variety of points of view. I won't betray any sort of cabinet solidarity by suggesting what those points of view necessarily are or attributing them to anybody. But I think there's a real sense that this government, despite some of the things it may have been doing around canceling contracts, particularly the ones that are legislated cancellations, that they are sort of open for business in the sense that there is a bit of an open door for people to go up with good ideas and good proposals. And although the train has left the station in terms of capacity markets, I'm not sure that it's hurtling down a track that is unstoppable. And so all of which is to say, I think I agree with you, AJ. I think that there should be more direct engagement between some of the stakeholders in the industry and the people at Queen's Park.
I'm thinking of the industry, the Class A customers, particularly on the demand response side. This is a terrific potential resource for them, income for them, and it also gives them a chance to potentially put batteries on site. And I know a lot of those battery projects are planning on that quote-unquote revenue stack, and this forms part of it.
But I mean, I think that then you have to think carefully, we've talked about the capacity mechanisms here in a little bit of isolation, without talking about the implications of global adjustment and the ICI. And
I was going to mention that. Yeah. In terms of the reviews, I mean, a lot of this is going to depend on the review that's going on in terms of industrial rates, in terms of how is the global adjustment going to be allocated in the future. I mean, are you going to be able to avoid all of it or a portion of it, or however it's going to pan out? I think a lot of that will turn on that decision that gets made.
Should we open it up so that participants from out of the province can participate in our market? Is there any reason why we shouldn't do that?
So, my view is that any capacity mechanism should be technology neutral, location neutral. What you care about, of course, is whether the resource that you're procuring can actually deliver. Can it show up? Is there any double counting, right? And so what we don't want is a resource to come in from New York, serve as a capacity resource, and then be subject to an override by NYISO. Because if that's the case, they should be selling capacity in New York, not here in Ontario. But this is also reciprocal in the sense that there will be resources in Ontario that may, depending on what happens to the Lake Erie Connector, for example, want to sell products, whether that's capacity or renewable products across this interconnection. So I think that Ontario both needs to think about optimal participation of imports, as well as positioning the market rules so that folks in Ontario can take advantage of opportunities across the interconnects.
Very interesting. Where does our, climate change mitigation kind of layer in a capacity market world?
Well, I mean, these are policy decisions that ultimately affect the prices, right? So any of these mechanisms can work within the bounds of the constraints that are offered, right? So whether you've got carbon pricing or not, what we're seeing in New York, for example, is a goal of moving towards incorporating carbon pricing in dispatch. So it shows up really in the energy market, less in the capacity mechanism. I think that all that can be absorbed, if you will, by the market design.
Yeah, it probably lends itself to showing up in the energy markets, and the emissions are directly tied to how much you want. So it probably makes more sense to incorporate it that way.
Yeah, very interesting. Just going back to the seasonal aspect that you mentioned in your presentation, AJ, can you just break that down a little bit in terms of Ontario's kind of energy demand and kind of where you see, is there anything unique about Ontario that players coming into Ontario need to be aware of? Or?
Well, I mean, in some ways, having seasonal products would facilitate greater participation because when we look at various kinds of resources, various kinds of demand response products, some have greater ability to provide in one or the other season. And we don't want to say, okay, as some other markets have done, okay, we're not going to consider you unless you go out and pair with somebody that's available in the other season. I think we're going to get more participation by having these seasonal products. We've also seen, an evolution from winter peaking to dual peaking and back and forth that I think will allow for a more economically efficient set of procurements by looking at these as separate seasons. That said, we always need to balance the administrative complexity against the perceived economic efficiency. So it's a bit unique here. I like it in theory. Whether it works in practice is going to be something else.
Any thoughts on that, Michael?
No, I would agree.
Yeah. Michael, a question for you. I don't want to speak out of turn, but I would assume our existing government might be happy if it could cancel some additional FIT contracts.
No comment.
No comment. No comment. Is this a potential way to provide a path of a negotiated out on those FIT contracts, theoretically? I mean, I think we're a long way from that, but, You think that's possible?
So you mean bringing a generator to the table and say either you agree to a negotiated withdrawal or termination of your contract, or we're going to pass legislation to kill it? Is that what
No, I mean, here's this shiny new carrot that...
We'll take away your revenue stream for the next 12 years, but on the other hand, we've got this new capacity market that you might want to participate.
I don't think so. Most of these contracts are renewable. I mean, it's not going to... It's like oil and water. It's not going to mix.
Well, speaking of that, where do renewables fit into the capacity market, intermittent renewables? I think that'll come down to the detailed design consultation when it starts. I mean, again, as AJ points out, you're being paid a fee to exist and be there and provide, capacity when it's needed.
But I guess solar and wind, by definition, are not necessarily as dispatchable. I mean, hydro is different, of course, it's renewable too, but
you can combine it with storage or
but storage is not quite there yet, is it, in terms of its ability to support renewables in a capacity market situation? Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I think the technology is there. The economics, it depends on who you talk to. But I think the approach that ISO is taking so far is consistent with what's done in other jurisdictions, in the sense that if essentially you're saying, okay, what's the historical peak coincidence of these resources, and then we're going to derate them. You're only going to get a fraction of the payment because you're really only providing a fraction of the reliability. And then on top of that, we're not going to exempt you, right? We don't care whether the wind's blowing or the sun's out or the water's there. If you're not there when we really need you, you're still subject to the penalty structure. So I think in a way, the capacity mechanism does incorporate the lower value that intermittency provides from a reliability perspective. I think there's still an argument to be made that intermittent resources should not get a capacity payment. But generally speaking, if we're looking at this from a large, from a system-wide perspective, we can look at historical probabilities and we can be reasonably confident of how these things are going to play out.
And they can hedge on their end, especially if you've got multiple jurisdictions, like a very large area, and kind of come up with technical solutions to provide better solidity or better kind of capability. So very, very interesting. In terms of the trend that we're seeing, and Michael, this is more a question for you, toward the installation of batteries in in particular the mush sector and in the kind of the Class A. How do you see that fitting in here?
It's hard until we have some certainty in terms of where the industrial rates are going. I don't know that I can really comment on it. When I've looked at some business cases, the economics of installing storage, global adjustment avoidance is a huge benefit. And if that gets diminished because of a different way of allocating global adjustment, the economics may get turned upside down following that. Yeah.
Right. And the demand response community, where do they come in here? They're, I think they've become quite strong. They've really done a lot in Ontario over the past number of years.
Well, they have demand response auction. I'm not aware that they've ever actually called on the resources to actually. I think they actually have them.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I'm not sure, but I think that the capacity mechanism is one piece of the overall market renewal. And I think that for the demand response providers, they need to be following all of those, the ancillary services in particular, but because of the unique services that they provide, I think it's important to make sure that they have opportunities in the capacity mechanism, that they're subject to the same performance obligations and potential penalties, but also looking at the other product markets is very important for the demand response providers.
At this morning's breakfast, the OEA breakfast, Paul Grodd posited the idea that the demand response should be taken down to the Class B customers, in fact, to a broader swath. Any thoughts on that world, like where we're getting down to even the consumer level in a capacity market, or is that just so far down the road that it's not even
Well, I mean, from my perspective, I don't think that the current mechanisms prevent them from participating today, right?
Yeah, because you can be non-dispatchable and still participate, so
yeah,
it's possible.
So there you could have potentially tens of thousands of solar systems, or, you know, gas gensets, Generac gensets. I mean, I'm not sure if we want to get into that world or not, but that's not our call to make.
Yeah, exactly.
Ready, standing by to provide power for the next 2004 blackout. Okay, well, we only have a few minutes left. Before we do, were there any questions? Any additional questions?
Just one observation from
Okay, terrific.
one of the demand response people.
Okay, really good point being made here by Rachel, that there is a lot of organizations reaching out to the government on potential capacity auction. I would agree, and there is a process underway, so that's certainly true. Maybe before we sign off, I'll leave you with just one final question. Michael, maybe I'll let you start. If you if you could whisper in the ear of policymakers in relation to the capacity market, what are one or 2 points that you'd want to kind of drive home?
Well, I like what Paul Broad said this morning about keeping the politics out of it. Set the broad policy objective in terms of what you want, and then let the ISO do their thing and design it and implement it.
Okay, great. AJ, any final?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would second that, but I mean, of course, this is something that we've all been saying in Ontario for the past, 20 years. But as much as possible, have the discipline for government to stay out. And secondly, from the ISO level, in my opinion, having a multi-year commitment option is important for the long-run investment cycle.
Absolutely.
Okay, any final thoughts, Paul?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I guess I'll just ask one very quick question because we have 4 minutes to go.
Sure.
We've sort of identified the lay of the land now. If you had to predict where we're going to be in terms of capacity auctions 5 years down the road, where will we be with the capacity auction market in Ontario based on everything?
Well, in a way, I mean, we'll know in less than 90 days what's going to happen in Alberta.
Exactly.
I think that clearly ISO is committed to market renewal. The government hasn't put forth any, we've got 90 days and we're going to stop this or review it. So they're letting that process unfold. And I think there is a desire from some in the government to try and create mechanisms, institutional mechanisms that go beyond the life of any individual government. And so there are some in the government that I think see the capacity mechanism and possibly LSEs and other things as being a way to create facts on the ground that institutionalize market mechanisms.
Yeah, I think there's so much uncertainty that I don't really know where we're going to be in 5 years with the markets. I think it's probably there. I think there's the even money chance a lot of the existing resources probably will get recontracted. To be honest with you.
Yeah.
You know.
I agree with that.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you that a lot of power producers, that would be music to their ears.
I think it would be, yes.
I have no doubt about that. So maybe I just want to conclude in the next minute by thanking our speakers. Tom, thank you for doing such a great job moderating. AJ and Michael, thank you for joining us today. I just want to mention in closing that this webinar will be hosted on our website. I'm not quite sure when it'll actually be posted, but sometime in the next few days. So for those of you who want to listen to it again or commend it to colleagues or friends who might want to listen to it, you'll be able to find it through a link to our website in the next few days. So with that, I will bid you all a good day, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.